Hello, today we're going to talk about the vision, mission, and purpose of an organization or company. More specifically, beyond the technical skills that the employees of those organizations possess, what makes an organization successful? How can they be successful? So generally, I'm accustomed to delivering this lecture face to face. In fact, this is my first online lecture that I've done. And typically in a class, I ask lots of questions. I use the Socratic method to encourage student engagement. So for the purposes of this video, what I'd recommend you do is when I do ask a question, just pause the video and write the answer down on a piece of paper. That's my best suggestion or best solution to try to replicate that same method in an online format. So with that being said, let's get started. So why is leadership important to an organization? You know, we hear this. Often leadership is, I hate to say it, being that I teach it, but it's often a bit of a cliche term. We tend to think of leadership as, a poster of a guy climbing a rock, and underneath it says leadership or something like that. However, leadership is incredibly important to an organization. You can have two entities with identical resources, equal access to markets, equal access to hiring qualified and quality employees. However, if one organization possesses poor leadership, despite the abundance of resources and quality employees, etc., that organization will suffer in some way. And when I say this, I speak from more than a theoretical approach. I speak from experience. Vast numbers of employees are disengaged. And when I say disengaged, they're not emotionally connected or committed to the organizations that they work for. So there's a recent Gallup poll, I say recent, relatively recent. We find that 70% of American workers are not engaged or they're actively disengaged. 70%. This is a massive number. In my own research, I found that the majority of Louisiana small businesses feel that their employees are technically competent. Yet in Louisiana, approximately 50% of small businesses don't survive more than 5 years, and about 60 don't live past 10. So organizations have technically competent employees, yet they fail. So the implication here is that technical competence alone, this is an important point, technical competence alone does not provide a business with everything it needs to survive. So in the U.S. and Louisiana, we have sorry, I'm repeating myself. We have technically competent employees, yet they're not fully engaged. So why is this? The central relationship between the manager and employee plays a huge role in the success of any organization. I presume you are all working professionals since you're taking this course online. So you, above all, probably realize and know already that people work for managers. They don't work for companies. The organizations that you work for, when you think of that organization, you're thinking of your boss or your supervisor predominantly. Organizations tend to promote employees who demonstrate the greatest technical competence, but not those who possess the greatest leadership competence. Now this is an important distinction. And it seems natural. We think of that rock star salesperson. Well, if he or she is so amazing at what they do, well, it's a very natural thing to do to promote them to manager. However, these are different skill sets. The skill set to lead and inspire, the skill sets to provide feedback and develop employees. These are different skill sets than in our scenario than that of a rock star salesperson. Now, research actually suggests that there's an uptick right now in leadership training. However, in my own experience as a consultant, generally, when times are tough, the first thing to go is paying for leadership training. So in my experience, businesses are not teaching managers how to lead. Leadership and soft skills are often cited additionally as a weakness amongst recent college graduates. So today, this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the purpose of an organization, the mission of the organization, and obviously what this course is about, the people and the behavior of the people within those organizations. So what is the purpose? What is the mission of an organization? And I'll let you pause for a second if you want to write that down. Generally, the first thing that pops into someone's head is, well, Dr. Gibbons, it's to make money. I'm going to challenge that. So clearly, for practical purposes, that is it. However, that tagline is not going to inspire your employees. It also doesn't do a whole lot to provide direction and vision of the organization. Simply making money, if that was the goal or the purpose and the mission of your organization, can be short-sighted. So the purpose or mission of an organization, it's why it exists. Why are we here? What do we do? It's more than money. It is to do something of value. It's a guiding star. So I'm going to provide a few examples here, but in my face-to-face lecture version of this course, we attended a lecture by a chef named Peter Scalfani, who owns a restaurant called Rufino's here in Baton Rouge, and he'll tell you that Rufino's does not exist to grill the perfect steak or to pour the perfect glass of wine. Their purpose or their reason for existing is to create an experience. That's why people come to his restaurant, not to get food per se. Right? They come for the experience. So Starbucks, I got a few examples here. So Starbucks does not exist to serve coffee. Starbucks' mission statement is to inspire and nurture the human spirit, one person, one cup, and one neighborhood at a time. And we can see this often, especially around Baton Rouge. Starbucks is not alone, but most coffee shops are laden with undergrad and graduate students busy about their studies and drinking copious amounts of coffee as they do. So their mission statement, Starbucks' mission statement, makes sense. Sony does not exist to manufacture electronics. Their mission or their purpose, the reason they exist, is they're a company that inspires and fulfills your curiosity. That seems a bit abstract, but think about what music does for people. Music moves people. It inspires people. It creates an emotional response. So Sony has captured this in their mission statement. Disney. So I have a great story about Disney. So Disney does not exist to make cartoons or to construct massive theme parks. They simply exist to make people happy. So here's an example of that. I worked with a consultant some years ago. He was a little older than me. I want to say he was probably his late 50s. And as a child, he was at, I don't recall if it was Disneyland or Disney World, but he ripped his pants. He was a little boy, ripped his pants right up the middle, so he is immensely embarrassed. We can all imagine how this would feel. So what the employees at Disney did was, obviously there are seamstresses and folks that can repair costumes and such at Disneyland, at the theme park. So what they did was they took him and they gave him a behind-the-scenes tour. And while they did that, they found somebody to fix his pants. Now, I guarantee nowhere in their employee handbook does it specifically state when a 5-year-old little boy rips his pants, we should give them a behind-the-scenes tour and sew them up, right? But they know that their purpose is to make people happy. Now, every time I talk with this gentleman, this story comes up. This was a huge impact on his life. He is clearly a fan of Disney just because of that one event. They made him happy. So what happens when we focus on what we do and not why we are here? So for the last few minutes, we've talked about why an organization exists. We talked about Rufino's, the restaurant. It simply exists to create an experience. Then we talked a little bit about Disney and Sony. Disney exists to make people happy. We talked a little bit about Starbucks. So these are why those organizations exist. These organizations exist. So what happens if Rufino's just focused on making food, or if Disney just focused on creating cartoons or theme parks with no thought to why we're here and what we are doing? So, excuse me. This is an example we can all relate to. So this is a photograph, or rather two photographs of New York, separated by approximately 10 years at the turn of the 20th century. And if we look in the 1903 slide, these are all horse-drawn carriages. And the red circle is around the one vehicle, the one automobile, probably someone quite wealthy at the time. And then we fast forward 10 years later, in 1913, and we have a circle, a red circle, around the only horse-drawn carriage, and the rest are automobiles. So this is actually a bit of an old business school trope. So I will amuse myself. Think of all the industries, the folks that created the buggy whips, the folks that created the horseshoes, or mounted the horseshoes, or created feed for the horses, or bathed the horses, or housed the horses, the organizations that picked up after the horses. Every single one of those organizations, those companies, those families, those owners were impacted. This is what happens when we focus on what we do and not why we are here. Hollywood. So Hollywood barely escaped being totally ravaged by television. Some film companies simply went out of business. Hollywood was the thought of itself as being in the movie business when it was actually in the entertainment business. Blockbuster, we remember these folks, and sometimes we treat them a little unfairly, but I still think they're a good example. Blockbuster saw itself in the brick and mortar video rental business. They too were also in the entertainment business, but they did not act as such. So Netflix comes along, and actually I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to talk about this later. But Netflix comes along with essentially they're in the same industry, and they completely decimate Blockbuster. We'll talk later on about how and why that happened. So what happens when we focus on why we are here? Okay, so what happens when Rufino's focuses on the fact that they're there to create an experience, right, versus making a steak? Well, you can pause the video here, but I'll ask you this question. Does anybody know when Nintendo was founded? The video game company. You know, the guys that created Mario Brothers and Super Nintendo and all the video game consoles of my childhood. Most of the time, when I ask this question at a lecture, students reply, somewhere between the late 70s and middle 80s. When actually Nintendo was founded in 1889. This is an organization that focused on why they exist and what was their purpose, not simply the bottom dollar. They actually started out as a playing card company, right? So this seems like a natural evolution, and they kind of jumped in some different things over the 100 plus years of their existence. But predominantly they were into video or card games, board games, and it would make sense that they would eventually evolve into creating video games. So let's talk about the vision of an organization. The vision of an organization is an aspirational description of what an organization would look like, or like to achieve rather, and accomplish in the midterm and the long-term future. It is intended to serve as a clear guiding star for choosing current and future courses of action. A vision focuses the attention of your employees and offers a view of the future that is better than the present. It paints a picture. It creates an emotional response. I'm going to provide some examples here in a few minutes. It is motivating. It is memorable. It inspires commitment. Right? These things, we can't get these things out of telling our employees that we exist simply to make money. It bridges the present and the future, reflects those things that the organization and its leaders deem most important. It is related to the organization's unique value proposition, things at which it does best. So we'll talk about, I'm going to ask you to pause the video here in a second, but I want you to think of, when you do pause the video, I want you to write down some positive adjectives that describe Disneyland or Disney World. We tend to think of families, children, attend their theme parks. It tends to be magical, right? So I actually have the original vision statement from Walt Disney himself, and I'm hoping that generally this works out in a classroom. I'm hoping it works out here. But after you've written all these things down, the idea of Disney, this is per Walt Disney, the idea of Disney is a simple one, or Disneyland is a simple one. It will be a place for people to find happiness and knowledge. It will be a place for parents and children to spend pleasant times in one another's company, a place for teachers and pupils to discover greater ways of understanding and education. Here, the older generation can recapture the nostalgia of days gone by, and the younger generation can savor the challenge of the future. Here will be the wonders of nature and man for all to see and understand. Disneyland will be based upon and dedicated to the ideals and the dreams and hard facts that have created America. It will be uniquely equipped to dramatize these dreams and facts and send them forth as a source of courage and inspiration for all the world. Disneyland will be something of a fair, an exhibition, a playground, a community center, a museum of living facts, and a showplace of beauty and magic. It will be filled with the accomplishments and the joys and hopes of the world that we live in. And it will remind us and show us how to make those wonders part of our lives. Now, when I do this exercise in a classroom, I ask, as I did with you guys, I ask everyone to name a bunch of positive adjectives that describe Disneyland. And often what we hear is playground, a fair. Generally, the word magic pops up, and this is what could be expected, right? The Magic Kingdom. We definitely think of parents and children, pleasant times. So what's interesting is, to this day, when you ask a group of folks, regardless of age, to describe Disneyland, often when I go back and read the vision statement of Disneyland, I'm repeating their words back to them. This is a great example of what a vision of an organization is to be. He wrote this mission statement before they ever laid one stone or one brick or dug one hole to build the Magic Kingdom. This is a great example of a vision statement. So let's talk a little bit about SpaceX. Here's another good example of a vision, aspirational vision of where we want a company, or in Elon Musk's case, humanity, to go. So per Elon Musk, SpaceX was founded under the belief that a future where humanity is out exploring the stars is fundamentally more exciting than one where we are not. Today, SpaceX is actively developing the technologies to make this possible, with the ultimate goal of enabling human life on Mars. Now, if we go back and we asked that question earlier, what is the mission of SpaceX? And we said, well, it's to build rocket ships and put satellites in space so they can make money. But according to Elon Musk, that's not why they exist. They exist to, because in his words, a future where humanity is out exploring the stars is fundamentally more exciting than one where we are not. This is an example. And forgive me, I am mixing mission and vision. They are two separate things. But this is the vision of his organization. The vision of SpaceX is to put man on Mars. That's an exciting and aspirational vision. So this is a side note, and you can write this down. You can pause the video if you wish and write this down. But why is SpaceX a game changer? Why do people make such a big deal out of it? Well, I'll give you some numbers here. The latest version of the SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket, excuse me, cost about $90 million per launch. It can lift a payload of about 140,000 pounds. This works out to be about $650 per pound. Now, if you read literature on the company, they actually put that number around $1,000. So we can bracket it and say it's anywhere from $650 to $1,000. Now, when we compare that to the space shuttle, which now retired, it cost about $1 billion a launch, and it lifted a payload of about 54,000 pounds. This works out to be close to $20,000 a pound. And obviously, the way SpaceX does this is reusable rockets. But that's my side note. So let's talk about strategy. So we've talked about the purpose of an organization, the mission and the purpose, right? I sort of use those terms interchangeably. And we talked about the vision of an organization. What is the organization going to look like in the future, right? So we don't know. It's difficult to ascertain what the vision of an organization is unless we know what the mission or the purpose of its existence is, right? So in order to know the vision, we have to know the purpose. And in order to execute that vision, we have to create a strategic plan. Now, this is not, I strongly doubt that this is anything revelational to you guys. But I'll point to this. One of the things we tend to not always pay attention to when we talk about strategic planning for an organization is the people. And obviously you're in an organizational behavior class, so that's what I'm going to focus on. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Why is strategic planning so important? Well, going back to Louisiana, small businesses, which are defined as 500 or less employees, or employ more than half of the state's private sector workforce. That's just about 100,000 shy of a million people. They comprise of 97% of the firms in the state, and they generate about 35% of the state's total export value. Small businesses are immensely important. Nonetheless, despite their importance, their longevity is short. We talked about this earlier. That most of them go out of business relatively quickly. So why is strategic planning so important? And I'll bring it back to the people here in a second. Many factors influence the longevity, or rather lack of longevity, such as excessive optimism, a lack of balanced growth, and failure to monitor results. But according to Beth Walker, the bottom line is most businesses simply fly by the seat of their pants, and they don't plan for anything. They have little in the way of strategy, and it's simply by good luck than judgment that they make any money at all, and clearly most of them don't. So when I conducted my research, I surveyed roughly 1,000 Louisiana small businesses, and we gleaned that about 34% of them actually had a written plan. This is important. And the other 66 or so did not have a written plan. Well, I'll get back to that point in a second, but I do want you to remember that. It's about a 30-70 split, right? 30% with a plan, 70% or so without. So let's come back to Blockbuster. And this is why this is important around strategic planning. This is the president of Blockbuster, Jim Keyes, in 2008. He said neither Redbox nor Netflix are even on the radar screen in terms of competition. It's more of a Walmart and Apple thing. Now, this is a conflation of multiple errors, not focusing on the vision of the organization, where they're going clearly. All right, if these folks had focused on the vision of the organization, clearly Redbox, Netflix would have come into the picture. They also did not focus on what their purpose was, their mission, why they existed, which was the purposes to provide entertainment. They saw themselves as simply a brick and mortar store that you show up and rent a videotape. So this is important, though. I want to point out this date. This is December of 08, so roughly almost 10 years ago. All right. Look at this chart here. So if you look right around late 08, between 08 and 09, this is when they started to fail. Now, I know these guys are a bit of a punching bag, and it's not 100% fair that I'm using them as an example. They were on some levels of aware of what was going on. He may have made this statement to try to pander to his stakeholders and his stockholders, but nonetheless, even though they were aware of it, they obviously didn't put enough energy into the organization to save themselves. I'm gonna kind of break off the lecture here for a second, and I want to make a point. So when I first got into consulting, when I finished my MBA and I started working in consulting, I always assumed that the organizations I would come in contact with would have these mesmerizingly sophisticated problems that required me to be an Excel genius and to understand Black-Scholes model equations and options and derivatives and market forces and the regulatory environment. And that's actually not, that's part of it, clearly. But what I found is that's not what takes an organization down. It's all the stuff that we're talking about now, or rather what we will talk about throughout the duration of this class. It's if people inside of an organization know how to communicate, if they know how to provide feedback to their employees, if they know how to instill a vision and a mission into their employees, groups of people can be remarkably resilient. And we look at the example of Nintendo. I'm sure they faced hurdles along the way, yet they still exist. So that's a point I want to make. It's not all the things that we think that take organizations down. It's simply the people in the organization don't cooperate. It's really as simple as that. They don't behave. They act with emotion and ego. They don't act in the best interest of the organization. They're often trying to climb that corporate ladder, so to speak. This is why organizations fail. So let's get back to the lecture. It's I want you to think of this. I'm giving you the answer on a slide here, but this quote is typically associated with Darwin. It's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent. It's the one that is most adaptable to change. This is actually Leon Magnuson, who was an LSU professor back in 1963. And the same can be said for his point that he was making is businesses have to adapt. It's not that you're strong, right? Blockbuster at one point was strong. Walmart is presently strong. It's not strength that keeps you existing. It's this ability to adapt. And the ability to adapt really falls on the shoulders of the employees and the leadership of these organizations, that they can learn from mistakes and make adjustments to live and fight the next day. So, why is strategic planning important? So earlier, if you remember, I showed you this pie chart. It was roughly like a 35, 65 split. So around 34, 35% actually strategic plan, about 65, 70% do not. And this is an important point. So an organization must have clarity of mission and vision before it can plan strategically. I kind of talked about this earlier, right? We can't have a vision. We don't know where we're going if we don't know why we exist. And we can't create a vision unless we have a strategic plan to execute that vision, right? So strategic planning, I know this is boilerplate stuff for you guys, but strategic planning is an organizational management activity that is used to set priorities, focus energy and resources, strengthen operations, and ensure that employees and other stakeholders are working toward a common goal. It establishes agreement around intended outcomes and results, and assesses and adjusts the organization's direction in response to a changing environment. So we talked about this earlier, right? It's not these sophisticated market forces or the regulatory environment that topples organizations. It's the inability for the humans in that organization to deal with it and to respond to it effectively. If there's one thing you learn in this class, I want you to remember that. This is why organizations fail. It's the people inside the organizations simply can't manage. And I know you've seen this before, especially anybody who's done an undergrad business major. So a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This is not a strategic plan in and of itself, but it is it gets the conversation going, right? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What are our opportunities and threats? What I would want you to consider is, when you do a SWOT analysis on your organization, we should also do a SWOT analysis on the people within that organization. What are the strengths of your employees? What are the weaknesses of your employees? What are some threats if they continue poor behavior? What can potentially happen? If you have rock star performers, what are some opportunities? Not just their opportunity to ascend in the organization, but what can they do for the organization? What can they bring to the organization that advances the company? I know you're familiar with SWOT, but and we are talking about strategic planning, but I want you to map this model onto the people of your organizations. All of us have strengths and weaknesses, every one of us. I'm working with a CEO of a company right now. He was formerly Army Special Operations soldier, and he worked in psychological warfare. He is a brilliant marketer. It's amazing to watch this guy work. He's a brilliant strategist, too. He can't communicate to save his life. That's his weakness. And one of the things we're working on is employees are leaving in droves because he berates them and beats them up and yells and screams at them, and they have options, so they leave. So despite his brilliance in one area, he is remarkably weak in another area. And this is an important point, because generally when we see someone, we deem them smart or intelligent or brilliant. That's a bit of a broad brushstroke. You can be smart, intelligent, and brilliant in some ways, clearly, and lacking in other ways. I want you to remember this. That's another thing we're going to discuss as the class progresses. So, moving on. So, SWOT analysis. What are the strengths and weaknesses of our people? How best do their strengths and weaknesses contribute to our organization's vision and mission? when we're looking at a SWOT analysis and we're attempting to strategically plan, right? We are to find those employees where their talents best align for whatever component of the strategic plan we're trying to execute. So we would determine 3 to 5 goals that would drive the mission and vision of that organization. We define what success looks like. So if I task either an executive or a junior executive or an employee or a manager, if we task them, the first thing we're looking at is what are their strengths and what are their weaknesses? Are they capable of carrying out this task? This is something we'll talk about later on in the course. We define 3 to 5 goals that line up with that vision and mission, and we define what success looks like. This creates a very crystal clear outcome and what we're looking for. I am getting slightly ahead of myself. I think we do a lecture on delegation at some point this semester, and I'll expand on that. It creates ownership. We establish target dates. We include a plan for follow-up and feedback. This is what strategic planning looks like. It's not back in the 80s and 90s, and data analytics folks will love this. We created these massive strategic plans and filled up these huge binders that eventually collected dust on the shelf of some executive somewhere. A really concise strategic plan, you can knock one of these things out in 2 to 3 pages. It doesn't have to weigh 5 pounds of paper to execute a strategic plan. That's also an important point. When you have a strategic plan, when you understand the purpose of your organization, when you've identified the mission of your organization, the strategic plan to get you there is not overly complex. In fact, if it is overly complex, it's hard to communicate to your workforce, and you might not actually be able to execute it. So I want you guys to remember this. So what's the task? What is the goal? Who it is assigned to? When is it due? This is more of tactical rather than strategic, but to support a strategic plan, this is the tactical element of that. This is really all it is. What is the task? Who's doing it? And when is it due? That's really it. And if you delegate appropriately and you follow up appropriately, you can execute those tactical movements that carry out that strategic plan, which support the vision of your organization, which is born out of the mission and purpose of your organization. So the Andrew Carnegie, right? The only irreplaceable capital of an organization is the knowledge and ability of its people. So as a child, I grew up and I watched Kmart, which is now they merged with Sears over a decade ago. But I always wondered why is it that Kmart can't do what Walmart can do? Well, it's very simple. Kmart simply didn't have the talent and the people that Walmart possessed. There's no magic reason why they're failing. They're failing simply because the people that comprise that organization are just not capable. The productivity of capital depends on how effectively people share competencies with those who can use it. So this goes back to how capable your folks are. Now, I want to make a point here. You're never going to hire the perfect employee. There's no such thing. You're going to hire very qualified employees, very capable employees, but once they enter the organization, they have to acclimate. And it's on us, the supervisors, the executives, the managers, to make sure our employees are trained and developed. This is how we get productivity out of an employee. We don't just hire the perfect person and from day one it's just magical and it works. That's not how it unfolds. By the way, this is engaged employees. So earlier in a few slides back I talked about Gallup, and we said that only 30% of the workforce is engaged. This is Elon Musk's employees. They are clearly engaged, right? And I'm sure Elon Musk made a bundle of money off of this launch, but that's not what motivated his workforce. His workforce, and we'll talk about intrinsic motivation again later on in the semester, but his workforce was intrinsically motivated. This is why they're happy, not because they just made a bundle of money. They're not worried about that. They put a rocket in orbit. Actually, I think this is when Elon Musk put his red Tesla Roadster. Well, it's not in orbit. I think it may be headed to Mars. But this is why they're celebrating, not because the organization made a bunch of money. So, people, if you remember, we mentioned earlier that technical competence alone does not guarantee the success of an organization. It requires a mix. Those hard technical skills, which are important, right? Someone asked me in my face-to-face class, if I had to parse out what's more important. Well, you can have a bunch of soft skills, but if you don't know anything about accounting, you're not going to be a very good accountant. You can have a bunch of great soft skills and leadership skills, but if you don't know anything about engineering, you're not going to make a very good engineer. So it's hard to say, but being that I teach this, I would probably lean into and say 51 to 49, right? Especially when you rise through the rank, 51 being communication, 49 being technical skills. Especially when you rise through the organization and you fill more executive roles. The higher within the organization you get, the less actual accounting you're going to do, the less actual engineering you're going to do. You're going to be leading people. And we said earlier that in the salesperson example, that just because you're a great salesperson doesn't necessarily mean you're a great manager. And we said that it's a different skill set to be a leader or a manager rather than to be a technician, an engineer, an accountant, a salesperson, etc. So it takes both, right? I don't want to take away from the technical competence. That's clearly important, but it's not the only thing, right? So hard skills, technical expertise, presentation skills, negotiating skills, time management, delegation skills, your craft, whatever your craft is. If you're a mechanic, if you're in the case of Peter Sclafani, if you're a chef, again, if you're an accountant or an engineer, like you need these skills, right? But when you're leading people and when you're leading an organization and you're establishing the mission and the purpose of that organization and the vision of that organization and you're tasked with getting your employees to buy into these things, you need to have a polished soft skills. So examples of this are trust, right? Approachability. Who's ever had an aloof boss or a boss that bites their head off every time they ask them a question? Interpersonal savvy, the ability to motivate your workforce. Who's had that amazing boss or coach or professor or teacher that simply by their presence just inspired you to do better? Compassion and listening skills. We'll talk about active listening down the road. How do you feel when you go and speak with your supervisor and you're sitting in front of their desk and the whole time you're talking to them, they're either piddling away on their cell phone or they're hacking away at their computer, focusing on something and only half focusing on you? How does that make you feel? How hard do you want to work for that supervisor or that executive? So these are incredibly important skills. Empowering your people will be your organization's greatest asset. So again, just as a recap, because we're at the end of the lecture here, we talked about vision, mission, and purpose. We talked about the why the organization exists. So we brought up Peter Sclafani at Ruffino's, who it's an Italian restaurant. He exists, or his organization exists, to create an experience, right? Disneyland exists to make people happy. And with this understanding of why they exist, then they can establish a vision. So if I exist to create an experience, well, how do I create that experience over the next 5 years or 10 years? What are some things that we can do to enhance creating an experience when someone walks into our restaurant, right? And then lastly, the strategic planning element, which is a mix of the direction of the organization, where it's going, and how are we incorporating our workforce into that strategic plan, because it's your employees that are going to carry out that strategic plan. So that's it. Thanks for listening to me rattle on for about 45 minutes. So we do have a few assignments due this week. If you scroll to week 1, there's 3 things I need you to turn in. The first is a student introduction. Really, this is my way to get to know you, since we're not in a face-to-face environment. I'm only looking for about a page. This should be pretty simple for you guys to do. Next is, this would cooperate with me. Since we just got through talking about vision and mission, I have a couple questions around this. So here I'm looking for no less than 2 pages, double spaced, Times New Roman 1-inch margins. Just answer the following questions. Again, pretty simple. And then the last assignment, so for the 360, if you scroll up to semester reading assignments and 360 assessment, this is for the purposes of the leadership development plan, which is due at the June 30th, which is almost the last day of the semester. So if you click, I provide 3 links here. So this is the registration link. Is right here. There is a self-assessment component. Just click on this link here. By the way, the registration, it does cost $55. You'll see the instructions as you go through it. And then the last is you need to request feedback from about 8 people. These shouldn't be family members or friends. These should be professional colleagues that you've worked with in the past. But this is the link you'll send to them. And all this is a summation. This right here is a summation of the instructions that are in this folder. So that's it. I hope you guys all, I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and hope you have a good week.